I wasn't looking for anything that evening. Honestly, I had just wandered into the small bookstore to escape the noise outside. The rush of traffic, the chatter of people, the weight of a day that felt too long. The place was quiet, filled with that comforting mix of old paper and faint coffee drifting from the little cafe in the corner. And then I noticed her. She was standing near the classics shelf, her fingertips moving slowly across the spines, as if she wasn't searching for a particular title, but letting the books choose her. There was something unhurried about her movements, like she carried her own sense of time, untouched by the rush that consumed everyone else. Her hair, dark with faint strands of silver, caught the light in a way that seemed almost intentional. She had this quiet grace, the kind you don't notice in a glance but in the way the air around her feels calmer. I almost didn't approach her. She looked older, more refined, and I didn't want to come across as intrusive. But when she pulled a heavy book from the shelf and nearly dropped it, instinct took over. "Here, let me help," I said, catching the weight before it slipped from her hands. Her eyes met mine then, deep brown, steady but with a flicker of surprise. She laughed softly, and the sound was low, almost like a secret meant only for the two of us. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice had warmth in it, the kind that lingers after the words fade. I handed her the book, and for a second our fingers brushed. Just a light touch, but enough to notice the warmth of her skin, the faint tremor in my chest at the contact. She glanced down quickly, as if she noticed it too, then tucked the book against her side. "You've got good reflexes," she added, a hint of amusement in her tone. I smiled, trying not to overthink it. I like to think I'm useful in bookstores. Doesn't come up often, though. She laughed again, shaking her head. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of laugh that slips past defenses, the kind that makes you want to hear it again. For a moment, silence lingered between us. Not uncomfortable, just aware. I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights, the turning of pages from a customer in the corner, but most of my attention stayed fixed on her. There was something about the way she held herself, confident but not closed off, like she had stories layered beneath her calm exterior, waiting to be told if someone had the patience to listen. Before I could say more, she gave me a small, polite smile and moved toward the counter. But the scent of her perfume, soft, understated, with a trace of something floral, remained in the air. And I knew then that this wouldn't be the last time I'd notice her. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. Yet a few days later, I walked back into that same bookstore, half convincing myself it was just coincidence. Maybe it was. Or maybe some part of me hoped lightning might strike twice. And it did. She was there, sitting at the little cafe corner tucked inside the shop, a cup of coffee in front of her, and the same book she had bought that night resting open on the table. Her reading glasses perched lightly on the bridge of her nose, and she looked different. Not in appearance, but in the way the quiet seemed to bend around her. She had a presence that filled space without needing to demand it. I hesitated. My first instinct was to leave her be, not to intrude. But then she looked up, as if sensing someone was watching. Her eyes met mine, and there it was again, that flicker of recognition, soft but undeniable. "You again," she said, smiling in a way that made her sound amused rather than surprised. I laughed under my breath, scratching the back of my neck. "I promise I don't live here. Just a coincidence." She tilted her head, closing her book. "Convenient coincidence." The words carried just enough playfulness to invite me closer. So I did. I ordered a coffee I didn't really need, then asked if I could sit. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her with that same quiet grace. At first, the conversation was light, about books, favorite authors, little things. But as minutes stretched into nearly an hour, our talk deepened almost without warning. She told me about her love for old stories, how they felt more honest than most people. I admitted how, at my age, I often felt like I was racing through life without really knowing what I was chasing. She listened in a way most people don't, her gaze steady, her responses thoughtful. When she laughed, it was softer this time, but it reached her eyes. I found myself leaning forward without meaning to, drawn by the pull of her attention. At one point, our shoulders brushed when I leaned across to point at something in her book. It was nothing, barely contact, but the warmth of it lingered like an afterthought I couldn't shake. She shifted slightly but didn't pull away, and that tiny detail felt louder than any word she spoke. Her hands fascinated me, not in a strange way, but in the way they moved, resting on the table, fingers brushing the edge of her coffee cup, sometimes fiddling with the corner of her book. Elegant, yet showing a trace of nervous energy beneath her composed exterior. As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, I realized how rare it felt to sit with someone who wasn't trying to rush the moment. Every pause in our conversation wasn't empty. It was filled with a quiet sense of being seen. When we finally stood to leave, our eyes lingered a beat too long. Her smile held something unspoken, and though we didn't plan it, I knew this wouldn't be the last conversation we shared. It was a week later when we found ourselves walking side by side after leaving the cafe. The sun had already slipped past the horizon, and the air carried that early evening chill that made people tuck their hands into pockets and walk faster. But we didn't rush. Our pace was unhurried, as though neither of us wanted the evening to end too soon. She wore a long coat, the collar turned up slightly against the wind. I noticed how she kept brushing her hair back, even though the breeze kept undoing her effort. Every time she did, my eyes followed the simple movement, her fingers grazing her cheek, tucking a strand behind her ear. It was the kind of small, ordinary act that somehow made the space between us feel more alive. We talked about little things at first. She teased me for my taste in music after I admitted I still clung to bands from high school. I teased her back, saying she sounded like a critic who secretly still hummed along to the same songs. She laughed, shaking her head, and for a moment her arm brushed against mine as we walked. That was when the air shifted. She slowed down, her steps faltering just enough that I turned to her. She wasn't laughing anymore. Her expression had softened, her lips pressed together as if she was holding back something that had been waiting too long. Then, almost under her breath, she said it. "You make me nervous." The words slipped out so quietly that for a second I wasn't sure if I'd heard them right. But then she glanced at me, quickly, sharply, and I knew she hadn't meant to say it aloud. Her eyes darted away, fixed on the pavement, as though she already regretted letting the thought escape. Something in me tightened. I could have made a joke, could have brushed it off to save her the embarrassment. But instead, I felt the honesty of her words land in my chest, because the truth was, she wasn't alone. I let the silence stretch just long enough to steady my voice. Then I said softly, "Good, I feel the same." Her head turned toward me, her eyes widening slightly. She didn't speak right away, just studied my face, as though searching for a sign of sarcasm or insincerity. When she found none, her breath escaped in a shaky laugh, part disbelief, part relief. We walked on, but something had changed. The space between us was charged now, like the air before a storm. My hand brushed against hers once, twice, and the third time I let it linger a little longer. Not a full hold, just the faintest contact, enough for my skin to memorize the warmth of hers. She didn't pull away, but I could feel her pulse quicken through that fragile touch, and it matched the rhythm thundering in my own chest. That night, every word we spoke afterward felt different. Not louder, not bolder, just deeper. As if her confession had unlocked something fragile and unspoken between us that neither of us was willing to close again. The days after her confession felt strangely heavy. We hadn't argued. There were no harsh words between us. Yet there was a silence I couldn't shake. She didn't show up at the bookstore or the cafe, places where I had grown used to finding her. And though I told myself not to notice, I did. I noticed every empty space where she might have been. I replayed that night in my mind too many times. The way her voice trembled when she admitted I made her nervous. The way her eyes searched mine after I told her I felt the same. There had been something raw in her honesty, something she couldn't take back. And I wondered if, afterward, she regretted saying it at all. Couldn't blame her. She was older, wiser, carrying more life behind her eyes than I could begin to imagine. I was 24, still fumbling my way through what it meant to be an adult, while she had already crossed thresholds I hadn't even approached. Maybe that was why she stayed away. Maybe she was protecting both of us from something that felt too risky. One evening, I found myself sitting alone at the same cafe table where we had talked for hours before. Her chair was empty. Her book wasn't on the table. Her soft perfume wasn't in the air. I caught myself staring at the door, hoping she might walk through, even as I told myself not to expect it. She, too, was caught in her own storm. I could feel it, even without seeing her. I imagined her at home, standing in front of a mirror, studying her reflection with that practiced composure she always carried. Maybe she touched the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, wondering if I noticed them, wondering if I saw her as she saw herself. I wanted to tell her that I did notice, but not in the way she feared. To me, those lines weren't flaws. They were the quiet proof of a life lived, a story etched gently into her skin. But words like that are easy to imagine and hard to say aloud. The truth was, I was just as uncertain as she was. What would people think if they saw us together? A woman in her 40s with a man barely out of his early 20s. Would they smirk, whisper, assume things that cheapened what I felt? Would she tire of explaining herself, of being questioned for even daring to want someone younger? That night, I walked home through a drizzle of rain. The city lights blurred in the wet pavement. My hands were in my pockets, but my chest felt bare, as if something was missing. And it was her voice, her laugh, the way her gaze lingered just long enough to make the world slow down. I realized then that I didn't just miss her presence. I missed the way she made me feel more like myself than anyone else had. And that was something I couldn't let fade into silence. I found her again on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Not by accident this time. I had decided that if silence stretched any longer between us, it would grow into something neither of us could mend. So I went searching, not in the busy cafe or bookstore where we had first crossed paths, but in the small garden tucked behind the library, a place I knew she loved. She was there, seated on a wooden bench beneath an old tree whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. She had a book open on her lap, though her gaze wasn't on the page. It was far away, lost in thought. The moment I saw her, my chest loosened with relief, though my steps faltered with hesitation. When she noticed me, surprise flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by something else, something guarded. She closed her book slowly, her fingers pressing against the cover as if steadying herself. "You found me," she said softly, not accusing, not welcoming, just acknowledging. I sat down at the far end of the bench, careful not to crowd her. The silence stretched, but this time I refused to let it swallow us whole. "I was worried," I admitted. My voice was steady, though my pulse betrayed me. "You disappeared." Her lips pressed into a thin line before she sighed, glancing away. "I thought it would be easier. For you. For me. I shouldn't have said what I did that night." I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees. "You were honest, and that honesty meant more to me than you think." She didn't answer right away. Her hands fidgeted with the spine of her book, her thumb brushing over it again and again. Finally, she whispered, "I'm not supposed to feel this way. Not at my age. Not with you. People would never understand." Her words cut through me, not because they surprised me, but because they echoed the very thoughts I'd wrestled with alone. I turned to her then, letting the weight of my sincerity rest in my voice. "I don't care what people think. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you, and how you feel with me." Her gaze finally lifted to mine, uncertain but searching. In her eyes I saw the conflict, the part of her that longed to believe me, and the part that feared the cost. I didn't push further. I let the moment settle, let the truth of my words rest between us. Slowly, she nodded, as if conceding to herself more than to me. "You make everything complicated?" she murmured, but her tone had softened, tinged with something that sounded almost like relief. For the first time in days, she smiled. Not wide, not carefree, but small and real. It was enough. We sat there for a long time, the distance on the bench shrinking bit by bit as our words eased into lighter tones again. When her hand finally brushed against mine on the wooden seat, neither of us pulled away. It was the gentlest reconciliation, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken. The evening we shared our first real silence together didn't happen in a cafe or a bookstore. It was outside, beneath the dim glow of streetlights as the city wound down for the night. We had wandered without direction after dinner, our steps falling into rhythm on the narrow sidewalk. Neither of us seemed eager to part ways, so we let the night carry us. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a car passing by. Trees arched above us, their leaves whispering with the breeze. I found myself stealing glances at her profile, how the light caught along her cheekbones, how her hair shifted with each gust of wind. She wasn't speaking, but the way her lips pressed together told me her thoughts were louder than the silence around us. Finally, she broke it. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" Her voice was low, almost hesitant, as though she feared the weight of her own question. I slowed my steps. "Every minute," I admitted. "And still, I don't want it to stop." Her eyes turned to mine, searching, vulnerable. "I don't know if I can afford to feel this way." The words ached with honesty. I didn't try to argue. Instead, I let my hand shift closer to hers, brushing lightly against her knuckles as we walked. The contact was tentative, uncertain, but it lingered. For a few steps, she didn't react, her hand stiff at her side. Then, slowly, deliberately, she let her fingers curl just enough to meet mine halfway. It wasn't a full handhold, not yet, but the connection sent a shiver through me all the same. Her skin was warm, faintly trembling, and the smallest of movements, the brush of her thumb grazing against my palm, made my chest tighten with something I hadn't felt in years. We stopped walking without realizing it. The world around us blurred into the hush of distant sounds, the dim wash of streetlight. She looked at me, her gaze unguarded now, as though every wall she had built was quietly cracking. "You're too young to understand what this means," she whispered, her words trembling with both warning and longing. I stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough for my voice to lower. "Maybe, but I understand how it feels right now, and that's enough for me." Her breath caught, a sound small but unmistakable. For a heartbeat, we stood in that fragile space. Her fears, my sincerity, the pull between us balancing on the edge of choice. And then, without ceremony, she let her hand slide fully into mine. The contact was simple, but it felt like crossing a threshold we could never step back from. Her grip was light at first, tentative, then steadier as she realized I wasn't going to let go. We walked on like that, our joined hands swinging gently between us. No words were needed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, alive, and brimming with the unspoken truth we both had finally allowed ourselves to touch. We ended up at a quiet park that night, the kind that looked forgotten by most of the city. A single lamp post cast its light over a bench, its glow softened by the mist beginning to rise from the grass. We sat down without speaking, still holding hands, neither of us ready to let the moment slip. She leaned back, her coat falling open slightly as she exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry weeks of held tension. I stayed close, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that our shoulders touched, the warmth of her presence grounding me in a way nothing else could. For a long while we said nothing, There was no need. The quiet was different now. It wasn't heavy with uncertainty, but filled with a gentle awareness that words couldn't reach. Her head turned slightly, and I felt the soft brush of her hair against my cheek. "I shouldn't be here like this," she murmured at last. Her tone wasn't firm. It was fragile, a confession more than a decision. I turned toward her, my voice steady. "And yet you are. So am I. Maybe that says something." Her eyes found mine then, and I saw the storm inside them. Hesitation, fear, longing, all tangled together. But beneath it all was something steady. Trust. She studied me as if trying to measure whether I truly understood the weight of what I was saying. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she let her head rest lightly against my shoulder. The shift was simple, but my entire body responded. My chest tightening, my breath slowing, my arm instinctively wrapping around her as if it had always belonged there. She fit against me in a way that felt unexplainably right, like the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was carrying. Her cheek rested against my chest, and in the stillness I could feel the faint rhythm of her heartbeat, steady and fragile at once. My fingers traced small, reassuring circles along her arm, not to claim, not to push, just to let her know I was here, and I wasn't going anywhere. We stayed like that, two figures in the quiet glow of the lamp post, while the world moved on unnoticed around us. It didn't matter what others might think, or what tomorrow might bring. In that moment, there was only the warmth of her leaning into me, the hush of the night wrapping around us, and the unspoken decision that we would face whatever came next together. When she finally lifted her head to look at me again, her expression was softer than I had ever seen it. "You're not making this easy," she whispered, though her lips curved into the faintest smile. I smiled back, brushing a strand of hair gently from her face. "Good. I don't want it to be easy. I just want it to be real." And for the first time, I saw her let go, not of caution, not of reason, but of fear. She leaned back into me fully, as though she had decided, finally, that the warmth between us was worth the risk. That night didn't end with declarations or promises. It ended with something quieter, more powerful. Two people choosing to belong, if only to each other, beneath the shelter of the night.